The JCC is committed to giving our community the opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on current events. However, we want to let you know that the views and opinions expressed by our leaders do not necessarily reflect the positions of the JCC. We're also committed to facilitating civil dialogue. So the Zoom chat will be open for this session, but please remember to communicate with respect for everyone, including those that we disagree with. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's presenter, Ittay Flescher. Ittay is the Education Director at Kids for Peace Jerusalem, an interfaith movement for Israelis and Palestinians, and Israel Correspondent for Plus 61J Media. He also frequently teaches gap year programs about the identity, narratives, and culture of the people who call Jerusalem home. Ittay, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I very much echo your calls for civility and calm. When I suggested this session about a month ago, I had no idea that I would be speaking to you from a war. I'm in my home in Jerusalem now. It's been a very difficult week, as I'm sure you're all following, and I feel like I want to do my session, but I feel like I have to just do a little check-in. So for those that are comfortable, if you can write in the chat how you're feeling this week about Israel, I'd be interested to hear that. Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling worried? What's the sense of how this week has been for you? I can say for me, luckily in Jerusalem we haven't had many rockets on our house, but I'm seeing a lot of the Jewish Arab violence that has spread really across the country, and it's frightening. You know, there's no Iron Dome to protect from civil unrest, and I can see words coming in: worried, heartbroken, hopeless, infuriated, dissonant, heartbroken, scared, hot mess, and I think a lot of these words are words that I feel as an Israeli Jew. I made Aliyah to this country 3 years ago from Australia, but before that I was a high school teacher for 15 years. I can see a comment from Sherry here about the response of American Jewry, which I'm sure has a great deal of diversity to it. And tonight's session is not about what's happening in Israel now, but it actually is. And whilst for the first half hour, you're going to think, what does this have to do with what's happening now? Hopefully by the end, you'll see how it all connects to what's happening. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. So as Cheryl mentioned in the introduction, I'm a journalist here with an Australian news site called Plus 61J. For those that aren't familiar with it, kind of like the Forward, I guess. It's a liberal-leaning Jewish newspaper based in Melbourne and Sydney. I've been the Jerusalem correspondent for the last 3 years there, and you can follow us at plus61j.net.au if you're interested in reading our journalism. So Netanyahu is, as you know, the longest-serving prime minister in the history of Israel. He's been in power for over 15 years now. And a lot of people have talked about why does his party, whilst he doesn't win elections, his party often gets the most votes. That's definitely happened in the last several elections. And there are several reasons given for that. Firstly, most Jewish Israelis are right-wing. He's very good at playing rivals against each other and, you know, crushing potential opponents by either bringing them within his party or attacking them enough that they don't get enough votes. He's got a very strong bond with the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties, very strong support from the Mizrahim. Israel's economy has been doing very well, and even after Corona, the high-tech sector here really saved us from having a major economic catastrophe. While the country is in a lot of debt, it's doing much better than many other countries in light of the pandemic, and is an excellent communicator in English and in Hebrew. Netanyahu is currently on trial in 3 cases. They're called Case 1000, 2000, and 4000. I'm going to quickly go over exactly what he's charged and what his defenses are for each of those charges, because I think while people are aware of the trial, not many people know of the details of the charges. And then after that, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about this court case, and then towards the end, the impact of this court case on what's happening in Israel at the moment. So the first case is called Case 1000, and the allegation is that Netanyahu received gifts from Hollywood mogul Arnon Milchan in return for political favors. Those gifts included a range of things. Interestingly, Mariah Carey concert tickets were one of them, but they also include champagne and cigars and various other items totaling $71,000. And in exchange for those gifts, Netanyahu was alleged to have pushed what's called the Milchan law, which gives tax breaks for Israelis returning after living overseas. And he also set up meetings to advance his interests in the Israeli TV market and intervene to prevent the collapse of an Israeli TV channel that Milchan had shares in. So that's the allegations in Case 1000. In Case 2000, the charge is that Netanyahu and Yediot Ahronot publisher Alon Moses struck a deal for favorable coverage in return for legislation to damage Sheldon Adelson's owned newspaper. In that case, he's charged with fraud and breach of trust. There are hundreds of hours of recordings of conversations between Netanyahu and the editor of Yediot Ahronot, which, for those aren't familiar, is a very widely read newspaper in Israel that seemed to be quite critical of the Netanyahu administration. The allegation is that Netanyahu was willing to sort of pass legislation to attack a rival newspaper in exchange for Yediot changing their editorial line to make it more favorable about Netanyahu. It's important to note that in this case, the alleged bribery or the alleged sort of gift for the bribery or fraud never happened. So Yisrael Hayom is still the dominant paper in Israel. It's still a free newspaper as well, which means a lot more people read it than any other newspaper, and it's still very solidly pro-Netanyahu, and Ynet is still anti-Netanyahu. So Netanyahu argues in his defense, Moses and I fooled each other. There was never any intention to follow through. The most, I think, serious of the three cases, at least in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many people, because this is, unlike the first two, this is the case where the alleged bribery did in fact occur. It's not disputed by any of the parties that the alleged bribery did occur. The question is whether it's illegal or not, is to do with Case 4000. So in Case 4000 has to do with a company called Bezek and Walla. Bezek is it's like the main phone and telecommunications company in Israel, and Walla is a very widely read online news site. Has everything from celebrity gossip to sports news to also obviously political news as well. So the allegation is that when Netanyahu was communications minister, he took regulatory steps to benefit Shaul Alovich, who controlled Bezek Telecom, in return for favorable coverage on the Walla News website. This deal benefited Shaul Alovich to the tune of up to $500 million. It also hurt Israelis in the sense that it gave us poorer internet and it gave us sort of less competition to a certain extent in the telecommunications market. And it also hurt the freedom of the press. There are many reports that for a period of time, about 5 years ago, that Netanyahu and his wife, Sarah Netanyahu, were effectively the editors of Walla, that because of this deal, they had direct contact with Shaul Alovich and also Ilan Yeshua from Walla News, and they were able to call at any time and say, we want this headline up, we want this headline down, we want this to be removed, we want you to put this story in about one of our rivals. Some examples of that, probably the most famous one was from Election Day on 2015, when Netanyahu said the Arabs are voting in droves. He put this live Facebook video up, which wasn't true, but it caused a lot of Likud voters who at that point hadn't voted to get out and vote. And that was up on the Walla site for several hours, even though it was an untrue video, they were giving this prominence because Netanyahu wanted many people as possible to see this video on election day. So I want to look at sort of opinions about his guilt or innocence by sharing this video with you, which shows Alan Dershowitz, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, a very prominent US attorney, and some critics of Netanyahu as well, to hear what they're saying in English about the trial.
Israel is the first country in modern history ever to put a political leader on trial for trying to get good media coverage or trying to eliminate negative media coverage. The Knesset would never in a million years pass a statute making it a crime to try to obtain good media coverage, because if they did, half of the members of the Knesset would be imprisoned. So if you want to try people on these offenses, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, let the Knesset pass statutes. But what Israel's doing is using vague, open-ended, broad statutes in order to create new crimes that have never, ever been used in a democracy before. So yes, this case is unprecedented, but the important part of it is not it's unprecedented because the prime minister is on trial in Israel. It's unprecedented because the charges being brought against Netanyahu are not crimes.
Professor Dershowitz, let me ask you if you
murdered his crimes.
Of course, we're talking about different cases. In the first case, 1000, the prime minister received expensive gifts from a wealthy business in America, then intervened to try to have the U.S. Secretary of State extend a visa for that businessman. Is that not a crime, a case of fraud and breach of trust?
Not at all. Let me tell you why. They don't charge quid pro quo because there was no quid pro quo. And if you want to make it a crime, let the Knesset say anything up to 10,000 shekels is okay, but 10,001 shekels is not okay. But you can't have a statute which leaves it up to the prosecution to decide how much is too much.
Professor Dershowitz, you say unprecedented for a prime minister to be prosecuted because he tried to influence media coverage. But Prime Minister Netanyahu deliberately took on the post of a communications minister to personally make decisions regarding regulatory issues in disarrangement with these two media figures. Isn't that a crime? If he wasn't going to commit a crime, why did he take on the post of communications minister?
Well, there has to be a crime. You can't charge somebody with motive. People take on positions all the time in order to achieve both personal and national goals. But it can't be a crime to seek positive or avoid negative media coverage. If the Knesset wants to make that a crime, let them take a vote. I predict if the Knesset took a vote on making it a crime to get positive media coverage, it would not get a single vote. Not a single vote. So
a few positive articles on a website for hundreds of millions of dollars.
First of all, let's remember who we're talking about. We're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, who's obsessed with the media, whose mentor and provider, Sheldon Adelson, opened a free newspaper for him and changed the entire landscape of news in Israel with a pro-Bibi newspaper that is distributed for free, with Adelson losing millions of shekels doing that. And Netanyahu likes to control the media. For a politician, it's very important to have it. And we know that the state witness in this case is the former right-hand man of Netanyahu, Nir Hefetz, who basically, as an advisor of Netanyahu, controlled the news in Walla. Look, the Attorney General is the former cabinet controlled the news website, and still was negative.
The Attorney General is
Israel is the.
So you can see there that that's just a sample of what you can watch on Israeli TV every night. That was the very few clips I could find in English, but you can find this stuff in Hebrew every night. It fills the news broadcasts of journalists, pundits, lawyers, arguing about Netanyahu's guilt or innocence in light of these charges. I'm just interested to hear if those of you that have been on the call up until now What do you feel about this trial? And not so much about Netanyahu's policies, because we'll get onto that in a minute, but any questions or comments from what you've seen now about whether someone who's accused of these things should be suitable to remain in office whilst they're sitting in court almost 3 times a week to defend these cases? Do you view him as innocent? Do you view him as guilty? Do you not know enough? And also, how does this make you feel, for those of you who are Jewish, you know, as someone watching this, to think that the Jewish state has a prime minister who's accused of these charges and keeps at least the majority of people, more people want him to be prime minister than anyone else. So if there's any comments or questions, I'm happy to take them. You can I don't know if people are allowed to unmute themselves to talk, but I want to make this a conversation. If anyone has a sort of insightful comment, I'd be happy to hear from anyone at this point. Yes, I can see a few comments about his relationship to Trump. That's something I'll get onto in a moment.
Do you believe the current war is related at all to the trials going on?
So that's the huge question, and it's all over the media, and it probably won't surprise you that it's very much split in a partisan way. That the left are accusing him of that, and the right are saying that's a preposterous allegation. I'm gonna go through the war in a bit more detail. So I will answer that question in a bit more detail at the end. But it's definitely something that is hovering over a lot of people's minds. Which is an awful thing to think of during a time of war, when you want to be, you know, united and focus on issues of defense and those sorts of things. So in November 2019, the Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit recommended that Netanyahu be put on trial. Approved the recommendation of Ronnie Al-Sheikh, who is the police commissioner at the time, to put Netanyahu on trial. I think it's important to note that probably there's no people demonized in Israel at the moment more than these two men, who were both appointed by Netanyahu. And Netanyahu and many people in the Likud very much see these two men as part of a conspiracy to remove him from office. It's important to know that one of these men is a scion of a Beitar family. The other lives in a settlement of Kiryat Arba. They were in no way left-wing radicals. In fact, as I mentioned, they were both appointed by Netanyahu. They were both very firmly on the right, but both of them looked at the evidence and felt that there was enough evidence to put Netanyahu on trial after over a year of investigation of all the testimonies. Netanyahu's responded to the trial by frequently doing posts like this, where he puts pictures of journalists who write things that are critical of him and calls them fake news. He lists various media news sites, Ynet, Mako, Vala, Haaretz, calls them all fake news. He tells people to only watch, Alut Slim, which is a more pro Netanyahu station. So his social media is very much engaged in the intricacies of this trial on a regular basis. He's accused in 2020, in July, he accused Mandelblit of being part of a scheme to topple his leadership. He includes Mandelblit, who's still the Attorney General of Israel. He says that he's trying to reverse the democratic decision of millions of Israelis through the courts. Recently, about a year ago, he posted this. For those that can't read Hebrew, or for those of you that this might look familiar to you, it's the exact same meme that both Modi and Trump posted. In reality, they're not after me, they're after you. I'm just in the way. And very much the way that Netanyahu sort of represents himself to the Israeli public is that the media, the elites, definitely the courts, the justice system, they're out to get me, and I'm going to protect you from them because they want to take over the country. They want to make the country more liberal. They want to make the country give land to the Palestinians, to end the occupation, to all of these sorts of things. And I'm going to stop that from happening. Almost the reverse, by the way, of what Olmert said when Olmert was, in the moment of about to sign a peace agreement with Abu Mazen in 2007 at Annapolis, and his trial happened, and he said, all the courts and the justice system are all right-wing, and they're trying to stop me from making peace with the Palestinians. So I don't know if the courts shifted their political views in the last 10 years, but it's very interesting that people always, who are accused of things seem to suggest that the justice system has the opposite political view of them. In 2020, January, Netanyahu really shocked a lot of people in Israel, but although this wasn't a surprise, but saying this publicly was something that really came out of the blue for a lot of people that view Israel as democracy, that he wanted to pass a law called an immunity law. And the law would say that any sitting prime minister cannot be put on trial. So that means that you couldn't impeach or you couldn't, try any leader until they finish their term of office. And the reason he wanted to pass this law was so that this is the cornerstone of democracy, because otherwise every prime minister will have these sort of trumped up charges that will be put against them, and then anyone can bring down any prime minister by making anything up. And so he is now very much in the last 4 elections pushing for what's called an immunity coalition. He's looking for 61 MKs that will support passing an immunity bill. He's not that far off it. He hasn't reached 61, but definitely at least 50 or so that do support immunity for Netanyahu for various reasons. But that's a big part of essentially why he can't form a coalition, because this immunity is so important to him, because obviously he doesn't want to leave his fate in the hands of the court, which could find him guilty and could send him to jail. He wants to pass a law that will protect him either by cancelling the trial and also perhaps protect him after office as well. So this is how the trial started in May 24th, 2020. This is what Netanyahu said at the opening of the trial, which his son, by the way, compared to the Dreyfus trial. For those that aren't familiar, Dreyfus was a French Jew that was accused of spying for Germany, and he was publicly humiliated and sent to jail in France. This happened about 100 years ago. And it's seen as, like, at least in Israel, it's known as the classic case of an anti-Semitic trial where you want to shame a Jew, so you call it a Dreyfus trial. So you can see even people, protesters in favor of Netanyahu, holding up pictures of Dreyfus next to Netanyahu. Dreyfus's daughter obviously was very horrified by these comparisons, but this is what he said at the opening of his case.
אזרחי ישראל, מה שעומד היום למשפט זה הניסיון לסכל את רצון העם. הניסיון להפיל אותי ואת מחנה הימין. זה למעלה מעשור שהשמאל לא מצליח לעשות זאת בקלפי. אז בשנים האחרונות מצאו פטנט חדש. גורמים במשטרה ובפרקליטות חברו יחד לעיתוני השמאל, אני קורא להם חבורת רק לא ביבי, כדי לתפור לי תיקים מופרכים והזויים. המטרה היא להפיל ראש ממשלה חזק מהימין, ובכך להרחיק את המחנה הלאומי מהנהגת המדינה לשנים רבות. אגב, לא אכפת להם אם יבוא איזה פודל צייתן מהימין, כאלה תמיד ישנם. אבל אני לא פודל. אני לא מוכן להתאתרג, אני לא מוכן לעקור יישובים, אני לא מוכן לעשות עוד כל מיני דברים, ולכן צריך להפיל אותי בכל דרך.
So you can see in that video, Netanyahu is flanked by almost every minister in the Likud party, and he basically alleges, I guess it's almost like a conspiracy theory that's really being brought to bring him down because he won't uproot settlements and other things like that. And that's why all of these cases have been fabricated against him. That's the argument that he's running, and that's what he wants the Israeli public to believe. Ironically, in 2008, when Ehud Olmert was on trial, he actually said the prime minister, up to his neck in investigations, doesn't have a moral or public mandate to make such fateful decisions regarding the state of Israel. There is a real, not unfounded fear that he will make decisions based on his own interests of political survivability rather than the national interest. And of all the accusations, especially now in a time of war, that Israelis level against Netanyahu, this is, his own words really saying, when you govern now, do you govern for the interests of yourself, or do you govern in the interests of the people? So in June 2020, there started regular protests on Balfour Street. They happen every Saturday night. They happened throughout the pandemic. They've happened even now during the war. They're very consistent protests. Sometimes they have hundreds of people. Sometimes they have 50,000 people, depending on what's going on. And these people are saying, we don't feel it's appropriate for Netanyahu to remain in office during this trial. Some of the signs bring in, ideals of intersectionality. You see there people from the far left, from the far right. Here there's a sign in Arabic that says democracy for everyone, police brutality kills. You've got this sign here, this is what democracy looks like. There's references to popular songs like Ein li Eretz Acheret, I have no other country, but really there's no organizer of these protests. There's about 15 different NGOs that encourage people to go to them. There's no one sign, everyone makes a sign on their own piece of cardboard. A lot of the people come quite young as well, that sometimes a protest almost have a bit of a party feel to them. There's a lot of noise. There's no stage at these protests, so no one gives a speech. Everyone just makes their own noise with whatever device or they've bought to make noise with, and to send a message that they're not happy with the current situation. And I think, to me, at least, when I look at this, and I live not far from Balfour Street, so I've seen a fair few of these trials, but I think there's a dispute in Israel really now about what the word democracy means. And I think there's those who support Netanyahu who believe that democracy is what the majority of the people want. And if the majority of the people want Netanyahu more than any other leader to be prime minister, which even today is still the case, he's still more popular than Bennett, than Sal, than Lapid, so then he should be the prime minister, because the majority want him to be in power. And what I would call the liberal democracy camp, led by people like Yair Lapid, they say that what's a democracy? Democracy isn't just what the majority of the people want. A democracy is about freedom of the press and freedom of the speech, and knowing that editors are publishing what they're publishing not because of political interests. It's about having judicial review of legislation and a strong Supreme Court. It's about having a separation of powers, about having statesmanship, or mamachdiyut, as we say in Hebrew, and most importantly, protection of minorities. And this relates to what's going on in Israel at the moment, which I'll get to towards the end of the presentation. So in the second hearing of Netanyahu in July 19th, there was many attempts made to delay the trial for various reasons, but probably one of the more bizarre arguments I heard was from Yossi Segev, who said, I cannot interrogate witnesses when they are sitting with masks on. How can I cross-examine someone wearing a mask? I suggest we reconvene in another 6 months after the coronavirus. So the notion of, I can't tell if someone's telling the truth when they're wearing a mask. Like, these are some of the straws, I guess, that Netanyahu was clutching at to delay this trial, because, at this time, no one knew how long the pandemic would go for. Thankfully, in Israel today, we don't wear masks outdoors anymore, but you do still have to wear them indoors. And there is that, this is part of the strategy to make the trial go on for 7-8 years, so that the court won't rule while Netanyahu is in office. They did get a 6-month delay. The next trial was on December 3rd, 2020, where Netanyahu's defense attorneys tried to dismiss the indictment, saying that the charges weren't laid according to the appropriate legal processes, again alleging corruption within the police department, within the justice department, within the court system. This was denied, but that was another strategy. And then more recent headlines that I've seen, these are all from April this year, all specifically relating to case 4000. You can look at some of the headlines now, that the CEO of Walla said, I was told to axe Sarah Netanyahu item or I'd sink a business deal. A trial Yeshua says Netanyahu was allowed to edit his own interviews. There's cases that Netanyahu even tried to put in stories about Naftali Bennett's wife, she's one of his political rivals, to make her look like an immoral person that eats non-kosher food, or sells non-kosher food, or cooks non-kosher food in her restaurant. All sorts of sort of very personal stories about his rivals. And again, also in the testimony, you have stories like this where while the Walla owner told the CEO, give Sarah Netanyahu everything, Netanyahu was killing himself for me. So I think in case 4000, and I think this is why Netanyahu is very worried, there is a lot of evidence that there was this quid pro quo of passing this legislation in exchange for favorable media coverage. And again, Netanyahu will argue, I'm only doing what every politician does everywhere in the world, which is contacting editors and asking them to give my side of the story, because that's what politics is. It's about trying to influence the media to get your message out there. So he argues that none of this should be illegal. I think the judges, there's 3 judges in this case, they'll be hearing evidence from the state prosecution. They'll have to decide whether the evidence mounts finding Netanyahu guilty or not guilty. Last thing I want to say before I open for questions is, what has this trial done to Israel? So there's 2 things that it's done to Israel. The first is it's almost made the words left and right redundant. So for 70 years, Israeli politics was divided into what was called left-wing parties or right-wing parties. The left-wing parties, at least since Oslo, were parties that favored the 2-state solution, and the right-wing parties were parties that favored the status quo or annexation. And what's happened since then is the media doesn't refer to parties anymore as left-wing and right-wing. And it's a huge change. Imagine talking about American politics without using the word liberal and conservative. You know, it would be like unheard of. But now you can see when the Israeli media talks about parties, they call them, in Hebrew at least, Gush Netanyahu and Gush Le'achlafat Netanyahu, or Gush HaShinoi. So the political parties are now listed as pro-Netanyahu parties or change parties, parties that are anti-Netanyahu. And what that means is that there are right-wing parties who are in the pro and anti-Netanyahu bloc, and there are left-wing parties who are all in the anti-Netanyahu bloc. But there's really been a change in politics here, and that's one huge thing that this trial has done, because it's united. You know, until a week ago, people were talking about Yamina and Meretz sitting in a coalition together. You know, the 2 most opposite parties, just because they both have this shared dislike of Netanyahu. On to recent events that are happening in Jerusalem. So for the past month, there's been 5, I would say, events that, at least as a resident of Jerusalem, I've been paying very close attention to, and also someone that works in Sheikh Jarrah in a peace organization, and also through my journalism. The first was the closing of the Damascus Gate steps on the opening night of Ramadan. The court-ordered evictions of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, which caused a lot of anger among Palestinian residents in East Jerusalem, but also even around the world. People are talking about this neighborhood now. The violence at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in response to Palestinian rock throwing. You can see in the middle photo here, armed soldiers entering a mosque, firing tear gas in a mosque. This, inflamed the anger of many, many Muslim citizens of Israel and Muslims around the world for that matter. The prevention of Palestinians from being able to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque. All of these buses were stopped at the Enchemen interchange, and while Jewish cars were let through, I actually happened to be driving on that road at the time, and I was let through, and it was quite amazing to see every single Arab bus stopped and all the people told that you can't enter Jerusalem to pray on Al-Aqsa because Israel felt that was a security threat. At the same time, Israel was saying, we allow freedom of worship, and that also again caused a lot of anger against Netanyahu. And then the last thing was the Jerusalem flag parade, which is again a controversial parade that happens on Yom Yerushalayim. And all of these decisions are connected to Netanyahu. And a lot of people say that the reason we're in a current war now is related to these 5 decisions. At least that's the Palestinian narrative. On the Israeli narrative, this war only has to do with Hamas and the fact that they're a genocidal organization that want to fire rockets and kill and maim as many Israeli Jews as possible. Another issue here is Itamar Ben-Gvir from the far-right religious Zionism party, who not only has been agitating for more harsh measures against Israel's Arab citizens, but actually opened his office in Sheikh Jarrah opposite the family homes of the people who were slated for eviction. They haven't been evicted yet. So it's pending a decision now from the Supreme Court. But again, a party they're very much part of Netanyahu's coalition, and Netanyahu wanted to come to power, doing everything possible to inflame Jewish-Arab tensions at what is a very fragile time. And so Chemi Shalev, who's a journalist for Haaretz, he posed this question on Twitter yesterday, saying the cardinal question was and remains: who gave the order to block the Nablus Gate, Damascus Gate, stop Israeli Arabs on their way to prayers, throw stun grenades in the holy place of Israel, and thus throw a burning match into a barrel of fuel? Was this colossal stupidity, or was it criminal conspiracy? Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister of Israel, he's very much laid the blame of the current violence that we have, both the violence with Hamas and the Jewish-Arab civil war, at the foot of Netanyahu, saying, perhaps he didn't want the war, but he wanted passions to rise to a boil because there was a possibility there would be another coalition. They were only a few days away in their negotiations, and that negotiation has now fallen through. And so there's the allegation that sort of Netanyahu wanted it to happen. Before I open for questions, I think it's important to hear Netanyahu's response to these allegations. This is a video from today, from an interview with Meet the Press in the United States. This is what Netanyahu said in response to these allegations, that his trial is influencing the way that he's governing the country, especially regarding this current war and wave of violence.
I want you to respond to one other thing before we go, which is your domestic challenges. You are under investigation for bribery, fraud, breach of trust. You've also had some difficulty for failed attempts to put together a government in the last 23 months. This leads to the criticism that your current actions are basically an effort to stay in power. And what's your response to that?
That's preposterous. When I was a young soldier, 18 years old, I held a fellow soldier who died in my arms. A few years later, my older brother, died while leading a rescue mission in Entebbe, Uganda, to release Israeli hostages. I've seen comrades fall. I've seen my brother fall. And I think anybody who knows me knows that I've never, ever subordinated security concerns, the life of our soldiers, the life of our citizens, for political interests. That's just hogwash. I'll do what I have to do to protect the lives of Israeli citizens and to restore peace. I've made peace with 4 Arab countries. I'm glad that we have a restoration of some considerable calm within Israel. That's my goal, to restore peace and quiet and to assure tranquility and reconciliation for all.
But this is a persistent criticism, Mr. Prime Minister. Why do you think it persists?
It persists because I've been re-elected 5 times. It persists because I beat every other candidate in public polls and in direct election simulations. Apparently, the people of Israel, the majority, don't agree with this false criticism and this cynicism. They know that I'm standing there for Israel, and I'm doing everything I can for the safety and prosperity of the Israeli people. By the way, all of Israel's citizens, Jews and Arabs alike.
Okay, so you've heard the arguments now. I'm going to stop the share screen and open for questions now. So you've heard the arguments there that people who view Netanyahu as guilty. You've heard Netanyahu's defense saying, I'm only acting in Israel's security interests. The reason we're in this trouble now with this violence is only to do with Hamas. I'll give my opinion at the end, but I'm interested to hear from you. What do you feel about what you've heard in the past hour? What questions do you have? And what do you and how does this shape your relationship to Israel as well? I think Cheryl is the host. If you want to ask a question, maybe if Cheryl can unmute you, because I'd like to hear your voices and see your faces. I don't like to just talk to text, if that's okay. But just make sure your questions are questions, not political speeches. But I would like to hear your voices and see you from the other side of the ocean.
So I think that if people have questions, why don't you raise your hands in Zoom? So the little hand, put the little hand up, and we can call on people. So I see Beverly Pincus.
If you can turn your camera on when you ask a question so we can see you as well, yeah.
I'm not able, I'm getting a message that the host stopped my camera, so I can't.
Okay.
But I'm a little confused about he didn't win. So I'm a little confused about who is actually making all of these tactical decisions right now. I mean, it's in my understanding is it's still Netanyahu, but he didn't actually win the election. So I'm just very fuzzy about who's actually in charge and how that's all happening right now.
Right. So Israel has what's called a transition government at the moment, meaning that the government of the last election is still the government, which involves a coalition between Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, meaning that the security cabinet can still authorize, military strikes and all of those sorts of things. What they can't do, and this is a big problem, is they can't pass a budget, they can't pass any new laws. There are various things that they can't do, but things related to security, the IDF and can still operate. And then obviously Netanyahu has certain privileges as a prime minister that he wouldn't have as a private citizen, which is why he wants to remain in office as much as possible during this trial, because I didn't put this in the slides, but I think this is a very significant issue. 3 weeks ago, Netanyahu tried to appoint a justice minister from his own party, Ophir Acunis, and this is something that the Attorney General overruled, saying you can't have a person who's on trial appoint their own justice minister who will then appoint judges in their own trial. Like, it's such a clear conflict of interest. But for those that are on that liberal democracy side, I think there's a lot of actions that Netanyahu is doing now that seem to be not ethical, I guess, for a prime minister to be doing, especially one that's a transition prime minister and not, officially chosen.
I think that the next question is from Michael. Michael, I'm going to ask you to
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you. So my question is, if you had any response to 2 columns I've seen by American Israelis who are living in Israel, Gershom Gorenberg in the Washington Post, who talked about how we should be crying for Israel. And then Yossi Klein Halevi, I noticed, just published a column in the New York Times. And I think key questions both raises that this time you have Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews fighting one another, which makes this war different. Do you agree?
So first, I'd just say I know Gershom Gorenberg personally, and his son works with me at Kids for Peace as well. So, and I have read that article in the Washington Post. Yeah, and I agree. I think Gershom Gorenberg's article didn't have any solutions, but expressed a lot of pain, and it's a pain that I'm certainly feeling now, because whilst I feel like this conflict with Hamas will end very soon. Thank God that it should end without any more pain and suffering. But the feelings of the violence in places like Lod, in Ramle, in Bat Yam, in all of these places, there's no Iron Dome to protect this for. And especially for me, as someone that's been working in a peace organization and knowing many people that have been in these civil society groups for the last 20 years, trying to build bridges and harmony between Jews and Arabs in this country, it's horrifying. And I don't think Netanyahu necessarily wants this violence, but the fact that it's happening on his watch shows that he can't prevent it, that he's not able to unify the people, and that in fact, many of the people within his coalition are actually, taking steps to inflame the violence, to constantly, blame, other people. And now you have like literal lynchings on the street this week. You've got almost every Jewish-owned store in the old city of Akko was destroyed this week. You had a beating of an Arab man on live television in Bat Yam. You've got destruction of a Muslim cemetery in Ramle. So it's I've never seen this level of chaos. Even myself, like I'm not going out of the house after 8 o'clock at night because I live in Jerusalem, and if I don't have to be out at night, I don't go out at night. That's that's where we've come to during this time, and it's horrible that I consider myself a Zionist. I believe in the Jewish state. I moved here with my family. I have 2 young children, and I believe that this place should be a home for all of its citizens. And it's heartbreaking to see this happening now at this time.
So I have 2 questions from people who don't have mics. So I'm going to ask them both together. They're not the same, and then you can take them each in turn. One is, do you not think the fact that Bennett and the Arab parties were talking about sitting in a coalition together, which would have taken his chances to get a coalition, was a trigger for him to take the provocative decisions that ignited the violence? And the second is, once things calm down, relatively speaking, do you think there might be some earnest discussion about electoral reform?
Inshallah, as they say in Arabic. I think Biden said inshallah as well on a tweet recently. I think we're a long way from discussion about electoral reform. I think it's desperately needed. I mean, I'm almost sure now that we're headed for 5th elections, which is like crazy that that's going to happen during a war. But the electoral reform is desperately needed. But given that no one will put that on the table, sorry, what was the first question?
Hang on, I've got to scroll back to it. Sorry, they're coming in very quickly.
I know. I'm trying to read all the chats.
So it requires that I go back. Do you think the fact that Bennett and the Arab parties were talking about sitting in a coalition, you remember? Okay.
So I don't know. Like, I don't think Netanyahu wants thousands of rockets to be rained on Israel. I don't think he wants Israelis to be hurt or injured. I don't think he's that evil. I don't think any prime minister wants their country to be in war. Even though war, we know this from history, that war always favors the incumbent. No one likes change during a time of war. At the same time, I don't think that Netanyahu wants this. I think the war that we're in now is not a result of Netanyahu's power. It's a result of his weakness. It's a result of the fact that for 12 years, he was trying to keep Hamas on a low flame, and he didn't defeat Hamas militarily, but he also didn't lift the siege on Gaza and allow the people in Gaza to have equality that they want and justice. He didn't do either position because I don't think there's a desire in Israel for either position. In fact, the desire of most Israelis to keep Hamas on a low flame, which means that you end up having this war every 3 to 5 years, which is what's happened under his entire term of office. So I do view him as responsible for that, but I don't think that I think the timing just worked out very well for him in terms of it happening on the brink of the negotiations, which now have ended. I also want to say a few words about Naftali Bennett, who I'm personally very disappointed in, because he was showing that he could, in fact, sit with parties on the left. And now that we see this Jewish Arab violence everywhere, and Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ram party, has said very explicitly that he condemns this violence. And he even went to a synagogue to help repair a synagogue last week. Like he's taken enormous steps to show the Jewish public that he's not someone that needs to be feared. So now that you've finally got an Arab leader that sort of wants to be a part of the political game, for Bennett to say, well, there's a war on, we can't have Arabs in the coalition, like that is, it sounds a bit racist, like that is, if the problem is that, Arabs don't have political representation and then are representing their interests through means that we don't want to see here, then surely the answer is to give them political representation in this country by including them in coalition and allowing them to be ministers and allowing them to having say in the budgets that are allocated in this country for areas that affect them. Arabs are 20% of the population. Over 40 years now, Arabs haven't been part of a coalition in Israel. It's a very, very long time. You've got absurd cases like there isn't one train station in Israel that stops in an Arab village. That's 20% of the country doesn't have a train station. Gaps in funding of education, gaps in social services, in medical services, in infrastructure, in roads. There's issues of gun violence in Arab communities. And I know Netanyahu has invested a lot in this through the 922 program, but it's still there's enormous gaps that need to be addressed. And to me, I guess, as an Israeli, as a liberal Israeli, maybe, I think that ensuring that everyone has equality is the best thing to give me security. I don't feel like security can come from walls and checkpoints and rockets and those sorts of things. They're short-term solutions, and they're obviously necessary when Hamas is firing rockets at me and my family, but in the long term, that's not a solution.
Thanks. I think we probably have time for one more question. Aviv?
Thank you. Just going back to the court case, is there a risk that of Ityashnut, that the court cases will just be too old?
No, they're because they're all allegations that happened in recent years, so that's not an issue. But obviously Netanyahu doesn't want the trial to drag on as long as possible, because if it drags on for 5 or 6 years, then he has it might not affect his time in office.
All right, that was a short one, so we can do one more. Okay. Andrew? Andrew, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's any feeling for having term limits for the prime minister. It would seem like these endless elections might be ended, and a lot of people probably resent Netanyahu being in office for so long, and it might eliminate some of the corruption that seems to have existed. Is there any feeling for doing that, and how would that be accomplished in the Knesset to be term limit?
So look, the majority of Knesset members support term limits. The problem is that the parties that oppose Netanyahu, as I mentioned, because they are from the far left to the center right or even far right, they can't agree on who they want as a candidate for prime minister, as an alternative prime minister, and you can't pass legislation without having a coalition. So whilst, yes, the majority of Israelis and the majority of the Knesset supports term limits, in fact, Gideon Sa'ar ran his whole campaign on that issue of term limits of 8 years. Passing it is practically very difficult. I just want to finish off with a slight word of hope, because I know this has been a bit bleak. So I spoke in the beginning of this session about Sheikh Jarrah, which is the neighborhood where there's all these issues of the evictions of Palestinians. And one of the reasons that Jews want to remove the Palestinians from that neighborhood in these 28 homes is because there's a tomb there of a man named Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the high priests of the temple in Jerusalem, and he's believed to be buried there. And that's why Jews consider it to be a holy place. And one of the sayings that Shimon HaTzadik said was from Pirkei Avot, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam hamed, al Torah, al avodah, v'gmilut chasadim. And I know tonight is a night where we're meant to be studying Torah, and because Shavuot after all. And something that I would hope for at least is given that so much of our conflict, here in Jerusalem at least, surrounds the tomb of this person, is that maybe we'd take a moment to reflect on the words that he said, and perhaps if we could all show each other more acts of loving kindness, of gemilut chasadim, perhaps we would be in a better situation. So with that, I'll say thank you for inviting me. I'm giving another session starting in 5 minutes in the same room about protests. If you want a copy of these slides or to follow my journalism, you can subscribe to +61J there, or you can send me an email at ittay78@gmail.com. Otherwise, toda rabba and erev tov.
Thank you so much, Ittay. We're going to take a quick break. So thanks for everyone who joined us. I hope you'll stay with us for the final session in this track this evening, led by Ittay, starting in just 5 minutes.